Okay, our studies on the decrees of God haven't been easy. I don't think by any means. They certainly require this type of study and this type of mental doing theology requires work. It really does. It requires effort in order to do it. They don't get any easier, but certainly as we think through these things, as we think God's thoughts after Him, this is certainly a God-glorifying thing, and it lifts our thoughts up to heaven and to God as we meditate on these things. Okay, so far we've seen that whatsoever comes to pass is all decreed by the sovereign will of God from all eternity. Now, hard as it may seem, we have seen evidence from the Scriptures that God also decrees evil and sin in the world, yet without being the author of it. How this is so we may not fully understand, especially since evil and sin can only happen through the decrees and the will of God. Now, what is more is how we as creatures are responsible to God at all if things happen because God wills them to happen in a sense. Most people have the idea that our responsibility to God is based on our freedom, or the freedom of the creature to choose. So one typically asks themselves when they hear the decrees of God, how am I going to be held responsible if I'm not free from the decrees of God? Doesn't that mean that I don't have a choice in anything that I do? That I don't have a free will? This is the question that we are now faced with in our studies on the decrees of God. We'll begin by exploring the different types of freedom that have been proposed in theology and philosophy. Now, here we must note that we do step out of the bounds of Scripture and into the realm of metaphysics, for Scripture does not explicitly deal with the topic of the nature of human will. It does, however, reveal examples of how humans most likely make their choices and what they are based on. We must especially be clear to define what free will is and understand its implications. Now, after viewing various proposed forms of choice theories, we must then evaluate, based on the biblical data, which theory, if any at all, is most consistent with the Scriptures. And then in doing so, we must then ask if the choice theory that the Bible appears to teach is consistent with saying that God does not, as the confession says, He does not repress the will of His created beings, or that He takes away the freedom or contingency of secondary causes. Now again, these are not light subjects. In fact, depending on which choice theory one selects for their worldview, again, they can find themselves denying the existence of the true God and change the gospel of grace. So then I say that basically because it is with a holy posture that we have to engage the subject and this topic. Okay, forms of freedom. Now, the big question that we're getting into to deal with is whether or not we are free creatures who can therefore be responsible to God for the things that we do. To even begin answering this question at all, especially as it relates to clearing God of the charge of committing evil and even determining evil through the creatures, we need to understand what is meant by free, especially as it relates to the human will. Philosophically speaking, there have been various views of freedom that have been offered. We will look at only a few, evaluate them, and then see which ones are most consistent with Scripture. Okay. Let's start off with determinism. Now, determinism doesn't so much describe freedom, but rather we're going to be using this as a matrix in which views of freedom have emerged from. Okay? Now, determinism, as the name suggests, is the belief that all choices are determined by something else. Every event that happens has a cause that makes it happen exactly the way it happens so that it cannot be otherwise. Now, each event necessarily happens, okay? There's no room for contingency or unnecessary events in a deterministic worldview. For instance, when a person commits a crime, so let's say a person commits a murder, okay? Determinism would argue that the person committed that crime necessarily, okay? That is, given certain conditions that were met, these would be the causes, okay? The person necessarily had to take the innocent life. That's the effect of the cause, okay? While this position sounds fatalistic, it is not, and there's one slight difference. Fatalism involves the belief that an event is unavoidable. That is to say, determinism at least works with human agency and, I guess, with causes, while fatalism could say that an event would have happened with or without human agency. In other words, determine operates logically in that given circumstance X, event Y will necessarily take place. Fatalism, on the other hand, merely posits events X and Y occurring without necessarily using any type of agency to get from X to Y. Okay? Hope that's clear. Okay? Another difference from determinism and fatalism is one respecting attitude. The determinist, since still an agent within the cause and effect relationship of events, may feel a connection to events such as emotions. Okay? The fatalist, on the other hand, accepts that since events happen inevitably, he has no real connection to events since they would have occurred with or without them. The attitude of the fatalist, in other words, personifies Doris Day's song, Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. Theologically speaking, determinism is certainly attuned in one sense with the sovereign decrees of God, which is that all things that happen have been predetermined from eternity. Thus, we could call the belief in the eternal and immutable decrees of God, we could call that a form of theistic determinism. That is to say, the Reformed, the Calvinist tradition believes that all events happen precisely as God has foreordained them or predestined them to happen. So, in a very real sense, a Christian who believes in the God described in the Bible must necessarily believe in determinism in a sense. However, the main critique against determinism is this. If all events happen necessarily, then how or on what basis is man free or is man responsible for his actions? For instance, to give a biblical example, the scriptures plainly teach that Judas was chosen from the beginning to betray Christ. Okay, again, John chapter 6, verses 70 through 71. Okay? Now, if Judas was chosen to betray Christ and the betrayal was foreordained and determined by God, this means that Judas necessarily betrayed Christ, for otherwise God's decree would not have come to pass and God would not be sovereign. And ultimately, again, not God. Now, is Judas responsible for this act that was committed of necessity according to God's decree? Now, a hard determinist, again this is distinctions within determinists, a hard determinist would say that Judas holds no moral responsibility, for Judas's action was caused by something beyond his control. However, a soft determinist would still maintain moral responsibility. Now, I think that Christian theism is right in maintaining determinism, for in it God is truly God and alone determines all things in the world. All things are ultimately caused by God in a primary level. God is the primary cause for all things. But again, still, where this view doesn't work is that the question of responsibility still lingers. Okay? How are the creatures who are acting out in accordance with God's predetermined will to be responsible? Therefore, I think, in the end, Christian theology must reject the position of non-responsibility from determinism, for it is clear from the Scriptures that God holds us morally accountable for our actions, as we will see in the great day of judgment. Okay? So that is determinism.